I knew things had gotten completely out of hand the morning I stepped outside with a cup of coffee and found my HOA president standing in the middle of my driveway like he owned the place. Not near it, not accidentally blocking part of it, right in the middle of it. His black pickup truck was parked sideways across the concrete, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, casually chatting with someone while my own truck sat trapped inside my garage. The crazy part, he wasn't even looking at me. Like this was normal, like my property had somehow become part of his daily routine. That was the moment something inside me finally snapped. Not in an angry way, not in a screaming, throw things across the yard kind of way. More like the feeling you get when you've been carrying a heavy box for miles and suddenly realize you don't have to keep carrying it anymore. I was done. Done being polite. Done being patient. Done giving people the benefit of the doubt when they'd spent months proving they didn't deserve it. And what happened after that morning completely changed our neighborhood. But before I tell you how an HOA president managed to lose everything over a driveway, let me take you back to where this all started. My name is Ethan Walker. 8 years ago, I bought a house in a neighborhood called Maple Creek Meadows. Nothing fancy. Just a quiet subdivision outside Columbus. Tree-lined streets. Decent-sized lots. Kids riding bikes after school. The kind of place where people waved at each other from their porches. At least that's what it used to be. For the first 5 years I lived there, I barely thought about the HOA. I paid my dues, cut my grass, kept my property clean. That was pretty much the entire relationship. Honestly, if someone had asked me who the HOA president was back then, I probably couldn't have told them. Then Grant Holloway moved into the neighborhood. And everything changed. Grant arrived like a man auditioning to become mayor of a town nobody asked him to run. Within 3 months he had joined the HOA board. Within 6 months he was president. Within a year it felt like he believed the entire neighborhood belonged to him. Now look, every neighborhood has that one guy. The guy who somehow turns a volunteer position into a personal kingdom. Grant was that guy, always carrying a clipboard, always inspecting something. Always finding a problem nobody else knew existed. One week he sent notices because trash cans were visible from the street for too long. The next week he complained that several homeowners had flowers that weren't consistent with community aesthetics. I wish I was making that up. One poor woman got a warning letter because her garden gnomes were apparently creating visual clutter. Garden gnomes. Meanwhile, actual problems like potholes and broken streetlights somehow never seemed to make Grant's priority list. But at first, none of that really affected me. I rolled my eyes, made jokes about him with neighbors, went on with my life. Then came the driveway. The first time Grant parked there, I honestly assumed it was a mistake. I walked outside, smiled, tapped lightly on his truck window. "Hey, Grant," I said. "You might not realize it, but this is actually my driveway." He looked up from his phone, smiled back. "Oh, I'll only be a minute." Simple enough. No big deal, except a minute became 20. Then it happened again, and again, and again. Soon I started noticing a pattern. Whenever Grant was making his rounds through the neighborhood, he'd use my driveway like a personal parking space. Sometimes he'd block me from leaving. Sometimes he'd block me from pulling in. Every single time he'd act like I was being unreasonable for mentioning it. One afternoon I got home from work and found his truck parked halfway across my driveway while he stood 3 houses down talking to someone. I waited. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Finally I walked over. "Grant." He turned around. "What?" I pointed toward my driveway. "I need to get into my garage." He looked genuinely annoyed at me, not because he'd parked on my property, because I was interrupting his conversation. That was the first moment I realized this wasn't carelessness. It was entitlement. The driveway wasn't convenient, it wasn't available, it wasn't shared community space. It was mine, and somehow that fact bothered him. Over the next several months I tried everything. Friendly conversations, polite emails, even copies of HOA documents clearly stating that driveways were privately owned property. Nothing worked. If anything, things got worse. Every time I pushed back, another violation notice appeared on my door. Grass half an inch too tall. Mailbox needing repainting. Holiday decorations removed one day later than recommended. It became ridiculous and everybody knew it. One evening my next-door neighbor Rick came over while I was grilling. He stood there watching Grant's truck parked in my driveway yet again. Then he shook his head. "You know why he keeps doing it, right?" I looked at him. "Because he's an idiot," Rick laughed. "No," he pointed toward my house. "Because you're the only guy who's ever told him no." That hit me harder than I expected, because deep down I knew he was right. Most people avoided Grant. They complied, they nodded, they apologized even when they weren't wrong. I kept pushing back, not aggressively, not dramatically. I just refused to pretend his behavior was normal, and apparently that made me a problem. The final straw came on a Tuesday morning. I remember it perfectly because it cost me one of the biggest contracts of my career. I work as an independent commercial designer. Most of my clients are remote. That morning I had a presentation downtown with a company I'd been trying to land for months. Everything was ready. Presentation loaded, suit pressed, coffee in hand. I walked outside 20 minutes before I needed to leave, and there it was, Grant's truck parked sideways across my driveway, completely blocking my vehicle. I called him. No answer, texted him. Nothing. Knocked on his front door. Nobody home. I spent 40 minutes trying to track him down. 40 minutes. By the time he finally appeared, carrying a breakfast sandwich and acting like nothing had happened, I had already missed the meeting. The client signed with someone else, and Grant's response, "I'll never forget it," he shrugged, actually shrugged, then said, "You should have planned for unexpected delays." For a second I honestly thought I had misheard him. I just stared, and he smiled, not a friendly smile. The kind of smile someone gives when they're used to getting away with things. That night I sat alone in my living room replaying the entire conversation. The missed contract, the driveway, the violation notices, the months of disrespect. And for the first time I stopped asking how to solve the problem. Instead I started asking why Grant was doing it. Then the answer finally clicked. This had never been about parking. It had never been about HOA rules. It had never been about community standards. Grant enjoyed control. That's what this was really about. Every time somebody gave in, he felt powerful. Every time somebody pushed back, he doubled down. The driveway was just the latest battlefield, and that's when I realized something else. People like Grant don't stop because you explain things better. They don't stop because you stay polite. They stop when they run into a boundary they can't move. A real boundary, a solid one. The kind that stands there quietly and refuses to budge. As I sat there staring through my living room window, an idea slowly began forming in my mind. Not revenge, not retaliation, something smarter, something cleaner, something nobody could argue with. The next morning, before the sun was fully up, I grabbed my keys, climbed into my truck, and drove toward a rescue center 20 miles outside town. Because if Grant Holloway was determined to keep crossing boundaries, I was about to introduce him to one that wouldn't move. And that was the day I met a 110-pound Rottweiler named Titan. Little did I know, Titan was about to become the most famous resident in Maple Creek Meadows. The woman at the rescue center actually laughed when I told her what kind of dog I was looking for. Not because it was funny, because she'd apparently heard every bad reason imaginable over the years. People wanted protection dogs, guard dogs. Dogs that looked intimidating enough to scare away neighbors, ex-spouses, delivery drivers, probably the occasional squirrel. She folded her arms and gave me a look. "What exactly are you looking for, Ethan?" I thought about it for a second. Then I answered honestly. "A dog that understands boundaries." That seemed to surprise her. A few minutes later, she led me through a row of kennels toward the back of the facility. Most of the dogs barked as we passed. Some jumped against the fencing. Others paced. Then we reached the final kennel, And there he was, Titan, a massive Rottweiler with a broad chest, intelligent eyes, and the kind of calm presence that immediately made everything around him seem quieter. He wasn't barking, wasn't pacing, wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply watching, studying, almost like he was evaluating me. The volunteer smiled. "That's Titan." I stared through the gate. Titan stared back. "He's huge. 110 pounds. Any issues?" "Rugged." "Not really. He's obedient, smart, extremely loyal, protective when necessary. The problem is most people see his size and think he's a status symbol." "What is he really?" Her smile widened. "A gentleman." The moment she opened the gate, Titan walked over calmly, sniffed my hand, then sat directly in front of me. No drama, no excitement, just quiet confidence. Something about that immediately felt familiar, maybe because I hadn't felt much of that myself lately. I adopted him that same day. The drive home felt different somehow. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about Grant. I wasn't replaying arguments. I wasn't stressing over HOA violations. I was just driving with a giant Rottweiler sitting quietly in the backseat, occasionally glancing out the window like an old man judging traffic. When we got home, Titan stepped out onto my driveway and slowly surveyed the property. The house, the yard, the sidewalk, the street. Then he walked to the edge of the driveway and sat down, right there, like he'd already picked his favorite spot. I laughed. "Yeah," I said, "I kinda like that spot too." Over the next week, we settled into a routine: morning walks, training sessions, trips to the park. The more time I spent with Titan, the more impressed I became. He wasn't aggressive, not even close. In fact, he was probably gentler than most dogs I'd ever owned. But there was something about his presence. People noticed him. Not because he barked, not because he acted threatening, because he carried himself like a dog who knew exactly where he belonged, and that confidence was contagious. For the first time in a long while, I felt myself relaxing. Then Grant showed up. Of course he did. It happened on a Thursday morning. I was working from home when Titan suddenly lifted his head from the living room floor. His ears tilted forward. A second later he stood. I followed his gaze through the front window. And there it was, Grant's black pickup, rolling slowly toward my driveway. Same speed, same angle, same assumption that he'd be parking there. Titan glanced at me, then back toward the truck. I swear it looked like he was asking a question. "Is this the guy?" I opened the front door, stepped onto the porch. Grant barely noticed me. He was too busy lining up his truck. Then Titan calmly walked forward, not running, not barking, not growling, just walking. He stopped at the entrance to my driveway and sat down. That's it, nothing more. Grant hit the brakes immediately. The truck dipped forward. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Grant stared. Titan stared. I leaned against the porch railing, watching. Finally, Grant rolled down his window. "What the hell is that?" "His name's Titan." Grant looked offended. "Move him," I shrugged. "Why?" "Because I need to park." I looked around dramatically. "You mean on your property?" His jaw tightened. "Ethan? No, seriously." I pointed toward the street. "There's parking literally everywhere." Grant's expression darkened. "I have HOA business," I laughed. "I don't remember voting to donate my driveway to the HOA. Titan remained completely still. Grant shifted uncomfortably. It was subtle, but I saw it. For the first time since I'd met him, Grant wasn't completely confident. The funny thing was Titan hadn't done anything, not one thing. Grant was reacting to his own assumptions, his own imagination, his own awareness that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't in control of this situation anymore. "Move the dog." "No," Grant stared at me. "You trained him to intimidate people." I actually laughed out loud. "Titan hasn't even barked." "He doesn't need to." There it was, the truth. Grant wasn't afraid of the dog. He was afraid of losing authority, and he knew it. A few seconds later, he pulled out his phone. I knew exactly what was coming. "You calling someone?" "The police." "Okay." That answer clearly wasn't what he expected. His eyebrows lifted. "Okay," I nodded. "Yeah, call them." The confidence he'd been wearing suddenly slipped a little, not much, just enough, because bullies rely on resistance. They expect arguments, they expect panic, they expect people to beg. When you calmly agree with them, they don't know what to do. 20 minutes later, 2 patrol cars arrived. Neighbors began appearing almost immediately. Porches, windows, front yards. Maple Creek Meadows had officially become live entertainment. The officers approached carefully. Titan remained seated beside me. One officer looked at him, then looked at me. "Has your dog shown aggression?" "No." "Any history of attacks?" "No." The second officer crouched slightly. Titan responded by wagging his tail once. The officer actually smiled. "Looks pretty calm to me." Grant immediately launched into his speech. He talked fast, really fast. Claimed Titan was threatening him. Claimed I was using the dog to block community access. Claimed I was creating a hostile environment. At one point he referred to himself as a community official. I nearly choked trying not to laugh. The officers listened patiently. Then I offered to show them my security footage. That changed everything. Within minutes they watched the video. Grant approaching, Titan walking out, Titan sitting, Grant stopping. End of incident. No barking. No lunging, no aggression, nothing. The taller officer looked at Grant, then looked back at the screen, then looked at Grant again. "Sir." Grant straightened immediately. "Yes." "The dog didn't do anything." Grant blinked. "Well, his presence," the officer interrupted. "Being present isn't a crime." Several neighbors laughed, quietly but not quietly enough. Grant's face turned red. The officer continued. "Also, this is private property." Grant folded his arms. "I'm the HOA president." The officer stared at him. "Congratulations." A couple people actually snorted. I had to look away. The conversation only got worse for Grant after that. Apparently he'd exaggerated certain details during the call, details the footage didn't support. The officers weren't thrilled about that. By the time they left, Grant looked like a man who had accidentally walked into his own trap. And honestly, that should have been the end of it. A normal person would have felt embarrassed. A normal person would have moved on. Grant Holloway wasn't normal, because 3 days later, things escalated in a way I never saw coming. It started with a violation notice, then another, then 3 more. One claimed Titan was creating visual intimidation. Visual intimidation. I actually had to read it twice. Another notice suggested my security cameras made neighbors uncomfortable. Apparently recording my own property was now suspicious. By the end of the week, I had accumulated more HOA violations than I'd received in 8 years combined. That was when I realized something important. Grant wasn't backing down, he was panicking, and panicked people make mistakes, big mistakes, the kind of mistakes that eventually expose everything. The following Monday evening, my neighbor Rick knocked on my door carrying a folder. His expression looked unusually serious. "What is it?" "You need to see this." We sat at my kitchen table while Titan rested nearby. Rick opened the folder. Inside were copies of HOA complaints. Dozens of them, different homeowners, different dates. Same signature, Grant Holloway. I flipped through page after page. Retired couples, single parents, veterans, young families. Everyone had stories. Everyone had complaints. Everyone had been targeted at some point. The crazy part, nobody knew how many others existed because nobody had ever compared notes. Until now. Rick leaned back in his chair. "Ethan," I looked up. "Yeah. I think you're not the only person he's been doing this to." Outside the kitchen window, Titan lifted his head toward the street. His ears twitched, watching something, listening, the same way he always did when something felt off. I followed his gaze. A black pickup truck rolled slowly past my house. Very slowly, Grant's truck. He wasn't driving through the neighborhood. He was watching. And for the first time, I had the uncomfortable feeling that this wasn't about a driveway anymore. This was becoming personal. Very personal. What I didn't know then was that Grant was already planning something far more desperate than violation notices. Something that would eventually bring the entire HOA board crashing down with him. And when that happened, half the neighborhood would end up taking sides. After that night, I stopped thinking of Grant Holloway as an annoying HOA president. Annoying people eventually get bored. They move on, find a new hobby, a new target, a new obsession. Grant wasn't moving on. He was digging in. And the deeper he dug, the stranger his behavior became. The first real sign came about a week later. It was close to midnight. Titan and I had settled into our usual routine. I was watching an old baseball game in the living room while Titan lay stretched across the floor like a furry rug that happened to weigh over 100 pounds. Everything was quiet. Then Titan's head snapped up. Immediately, no barking, no growling, just instant attention. I muted the television. A few seconds later, I heard it too. Footsteps, outside, slow, careful. The kind of footsteps people use when they don't want to be heard. Titan stood, every muscle in his body suddenly alert. I walked toward the front window and peeked through the blinds. At first, I thought it was a stranger. Then the motion light clicked on, and my stomach dropped. It was Grant, standing in my driveway, at midnight, holding a camera. For several seconds, I just stared. Because honestly, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. This was the HOA president, the guy who constantly lectured everyone about rules, the self-appointed guardian of neighborhood standards, sneaking around someone's property in the middle of the night, taking pictures. Titan released a low rumble from deep inside his chest. Grant immediately stepped backward. I opened the front door. "Grant," he froze. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he lifted the camera. "I'm documenting violations." I laughed. I couldn't help it. Actually laughed at midnight in my driveway. "You serious?" His eyes narrowed. "You think this is funny?" "No," I said. "I think it's sad." That hit a nerve. I could see it immediately. Grant's face tightened. His jaw flexed. For months he'd been the guy asking questions. Now he was the guy getting questioned. And he hated it. "You've been undermining community leadership." I blinked. "What?" "You've turned people against me." There it was, the truth, not the driveway, not the dog, not the HOA, his ego. The entire thing had always been about his ego. Before I could respond, Titan stepped onto the porch beside me. Grant noticed instantly. His confidence disappeared. Not because Titan threatened him. Because Titan represented something Grant couldn't control. And by that point, losing control was becoming his greatest fear. He left a few moments later, but as he walked away, he turned around and pointed toward me. "This isn't over." I remember shaking my head, because deep down I knew something he didn't. People who constantly announce they're not finished are usually already losing. The next morning, I received a phone call from someone I never expected, a member of the HOA board named Michael Barnes. Unlike Grant, Michael actually had a reputation for being reasonable. Quiet, fair, the type of guy who preferred fixing problems instead of creating them. His voice sounded exhausted. "Ethan, we need to talk." That was never a good sign. An hour later, we met at the clubhouse. What I saw there honestly shocked me. Stacks of folders, boxes of paperwork, printed emails covering an entire conference table. Michael rubbed his forehead. "You're not the only complaint." "How many?" He gave a humorless laugh. We stopped counting. Over the next hour, I learned something incredible. Dozens of homeowners had come forward. Not 2, not 5, dozens. People Grant had fined, threatened, targeted, bullied. People who had stayed silent because they thought they were alone. Turns out they weren't. One retired couple had received 7 violation notices in a single month. A widow had been threatened with legal action over flower pots. A military veteran had accumulated thousands of dollars in questionable fines. The stories just kept coming, and every single one pointed back to Grant. The more evidence we uncovered, the worse it looked. Then someone found something that changed everything. Financial records. Grant had been approving expenses without proper board votes. Nothing criminal, nothing dramatic, but enough to raise serious questions. Enough to trigger an independent review. And once that review started, the entire house of cards began wobbling. Word spread through Maple Creek Meadows faster than a wildfire. Neighbors started talking, comparing experiences, sharing emails, sharing notices, sharing stories they'd been keeping to themselves for years. For the first time since I'd moved there, the neighborhood actually felt united. Ironically, Grant had finally accomplished what every HOA president claimed to want. He brought the community together. Just not in the way he intended. Then came the emergency board meeting. The clubhouse was packed, standing room only. People lined the walls, filled the hallways, some even stood outside listening through open windows. Grant arrived wearing a suit, which immediately told me he knew exactly how serious things had become. He looked tired, older somehow, like the last few weeks had aged him years, but the arrogance was still there, still hanging on, still refusing to let go. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. Evidence was presented, statements were read, videos were shown, emails appeared on projector screens. Every excuse Grant offered seemed to create 3 new problems, and then came the vote. I'll never forget that moment. The room was completely silent. You could hear people breathing. One by one, the board members raised their hands. The decision was unanimous. Grant Holloway was removed as HOA president, permanently. A collective exhale swept through the room. Not cheering, not celebration, relief, pure relief. Like an entire neighborhood had finally set down a burden it had been carrying for years. Grant just sat there, staring, not angry, not yelling, just stunned. Like he genuinely couldn't understand how things had ended this way. Maybe because people like Grant spend so much time controlling others that they forget one important fact. Control only exists as long as people agree to it. Once they stop agreeing, everything changes. I thought that would be the last time I saw him. I was wrong. 3 days later, I was walking Titan near the entrance of the neighborhood when a familiar black pickup pulled into the parking lot beside the community sign. Grant stepped out, alone. No clipboard, no authority, no audience, just Grant. For a second, neither of us spoke. Titan stood calmly beside me, watching. Grant looked tired, really tired. The kind of tired that comes from fighting battles you've already lost. Finally, he shook his head. "You know what the worst part is?" I didn't answer. He laughed bitterly. "I actually thought I was helping." That caught me off guard, because for the first time since I'd met him, he sounded honest, not defensive, not manipulative, just honest. "I thought if I controlled everything," he continued, "people would respect me." The silence that followed felt strangely heavy. Because underneath all the arrogance and bullying and nonsense, there it was. The real problem, not power, not rules, fear. A man so desperate to matter that he tried to control everyone around him, and somewhere along the way he lost himself. Grant glanced at Titan, then at me. "I hated that dog," I laughed. "Yeah, I noticed." Another small smile appeared. The first genuine smile I'd ever seen from him. Then he climbed back into his truck and drove away. And that was the last time I ever spoke to Grant Holloway. A few months later, the HOA adopted new policies. No president could issue violations without board approval. Financial oversight increased. Transparency improved. Power was spread out instead of concentrated. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal. Kids played outside again. Neighbors talked. People relaxed. And as for Titan, well, he became something of a local celebrity. The giant Rottweiler who accidentally helped bring down an HOA president. Not because he was aggressive. Not because he scared anyone. Because he sat in a driveway and quietly refused to move. Funny when you think about it. The biggest lesson from this whole mess didn't come from lawyers or board meetings or police reports. It came from a dog. Titan never argued, never threatened, never tried to dominate anyone. He simply understood where the boundary was and stood there. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's exactly what's needed. Looking back now, I still wonder about Grant. Was he a bully? Absolutely. Did he abuse his position? Without question. But was he also a guy who got lost inside his own need for control? Maybe. And honestly, that's the part of the story people in my neighborhood still argue about. Some say he got exactly what he deserved. Others think things went too far. Even now, years later, opinions are split. So I'm curious what you think. If you had been in my position, would you have handled it differently? Do people like Grant deserve sympathy once they finally face consequences? Or does accountability matter more than intention? Let me know down in the comments because I genuinely want to hear your perspective. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA nightmare, a power-hungry neighbor, or someone who simply refused to respect boundaries, share your story below. Trust me, after everything that happened in Maple Creek Meadows, I know we're definitely not the only ones.